Brutal street fighting ensued as the redcoats moved along the narrow alleyways. They were taking heavy fire all the way.
So if you've got a few mutineers on the roof just shooting down at you, taking pot shots, it's very difficult to actually get to them.
It's almost impossible to comprehend the bravery of those brave engineers led by Lieutenants Holm and Sackold. Okay, I'm standing here by the Kashmir Gate in Delhi. This was the scene of some of the bitterest fighting of the War of 1857 that we know in Britain as the Sepoy Mutiny, that's known here as the First War of Independence. This is a full and in-depth documentary that combines a number of previous videos as well as new material about the final battles of the war. We'll be looking at the battles of Delhi, Cawnpore, Lucknow, Jhansi and Gwalior. It was a tough war with both brutality and exceptional bravery on both sides. It's a conflict that has become heavily politicised, but that's not what we are here to talk about today. I think descendants of the warriors who fought on both sides should learn these stories and decide for themselves how the men should be remembered. But before we get into that, let's learn why it all happened in the first place. The 10th of May 1857 was a hot day in the garrison town of Meerut, northeast of Delhi. The Indian sepoys and the sowars of the Bengal cavalry were angry. 85 of their colleagues had just been put in jail for refusing to fire the new Enfield rifle. Suddenly there was a commotion. Men were running. Muskets were being gathered. The sowars of the 3rd Bengal Light Cavalry were rushing to the jail to release their comrades. Gunshots rang out around the town. Smoke could be seen billowing above the bazaar. Local civilians joined in the chaos. Soon it was a full-scale riot. Any Christian unlucky enough to be caught by the mob was attacked, and many were killed. The British officers, shocked at what were happening, were very slow to respond. By the time European troops were organised and sent out to confront these mutineers, it was too late. They were already on the road heading to Delhi, where they hoped to encourage the Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar to join them and lead a general uprising against the East India Company. The war had begun. But how did we get to this point? Let's go back a little bit. Over the previous 100 years since the Battle of Plassey in 1757, well covered on this channel, the British East India Company had been expanding across the Indian subcontinent. They had recently advanced into the areas of Sindh and Punjab. But they had been exposed and embarrassed during the retreat from Kabul in 1842. A retreat that saw the Indian sepoys, as much as anybody, suffer horrifically. Those sepoys and their families who weren't killed in the retreat were often captured and then sold into slavery. It's important to mention this because that retreat and the ineptitude of many British officers had a profound effect on the soldiers of the Bengal East India Company's army. It was clear now that the British were not invincible and perhaps might actually be on the decline. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let's take a quick look at the sepoys themselves. Who were these men? What was their background? Where did they come from? Well, firstly, it's worth pointing out that there were actually 3 Presidency armies in India run by the East India Company. There was the Bombay Army, Madras and Bengal. And it's Bengal, the Bengal Army, that I'm going to focus on here today because it was that army that was at the centre of the mutiny. The men of these regiments were mainly recruited from the northern provinces of India, places like Bihar and Awadh, or Oudh as it's often written. They were generally high-caste Hindus, strong men, physically imposing and incredibly devout. Their religion was a huge part of their life and it was at the heart of everything they did. We're talking about men so devout that even the shadow of a Christian passing across their food would mean they wouldn't eat it. The same men who would follow a white officer's orders to go to their death storming a breach would refuse to share a glass of water with the same man. And it was this piety that was at the heart of the uprising. But of course there were other reasons too. There was a thing called batter, which was hardship pay. That got cut for service in places like Sindh. And of course there was that slow rate of promotion, which meant even a very experienced, very knowledgeable local recruit could never be more senior than the youngest, greenest British ensign straight from England. You could really see how that would wrangle. And that relationship with those white officers had really begun to decline in recent years. It seems that many of the new officers lacked an understanding of their men, spent little time with them, and often struggled to speak Hindi or Urdu. The recent British annexation of Awadh, the state where the city of Lucknow is situated, had also seen a very negative response. Many of the sepoys were from this region, and they were livid at the way the East India Company had deposed their Nawab, or their king. There was also a very powerful growing concern within the army that the British were trying to convert them to Christianity, that they wanted to undermine their religion. This was something even the most loyal sepoy would not stand for. The warning signs should have been clear to the British. There were previous examples of mutinies, for example at Vellore in 1806. Over 100 Europeans were killed after the local sepoys were told they had to wear leather and remove their caste marks. And more recently, in 1855, Muslim sowars of the 3rd Native Cavalry had attacked Brigadier Colin Mackenzie with swords after he forbid them from celebrating the Shia festival of Muharram. But all of these problems came to a head over the issue of a new rifle. This does get complicated, so let me try and keep it simple. It was all about this weapon, the Enfield, aka the P53, a muzzle-loading rifled musket. The rifled musket was an important development for British infantry. It gave them an improved range and accuracy over the old smoothbore musket. A rifled barrel has grooves in it that allows the bullet to spin, come out straighter. In fact, some authors call the Enfield Britain's first modern infantry weapon. At some point I plan to make an entire video on how that weapon changed the face of warfare and took us to where we are now in terms of modern light infantry tactics. But that's a story for another day. The problem with the new weapon was that rumours quickly began to spread that the bullet was greased with cow and pig fat, and as it had to be bit to be loaded, you could see how that would be a problem. Because as we've discussed, those sepoys, those Hindus and Muslims were incredibly religious, and the thought of polluting themselves with anything related to cow and pig fat was just totally anathema to them. And it seems their fears weren't totally without basis. When pushed, even British officers couldn't actually confirm exactly what fat had been used. In January 1857, a number of senior Indian soldiers expressed their concern over this to their officers. And so the decision was made that the Indian sepoys would be allowed to grease their own cartridges using things like ghee or wax. This seemed like an obvious solution, but it was too late. The trust had been lost, and those rumours continued to spread, making an even deeper divide between the British and their Indian soldiers. Before long, the anger continued to grow, and many sepoys declared their intention to refuse to fire the new weapon. And so we come full circle and return to Meerut, where at the end of April 1857, Lieutenant Colonel George Carmichael Smythe decided to put his cavalry sowars to the test and organise a firing parade. 85 of the 90 men who were tasked with firing the weapon in front of the parade refused. They were then charged and later put in jail. It was those men that were freed on the day the rioting broke out. They were seen as heroes by their colleagues for standing up for what they believed in. The Indian Mutiny, the Sepoy Mutiny, or what in India is known as the First War of Independence, had now begun. By the way guys, I just want to interrupt really quickly to ask, what do you think to this t-shirt? If you're half the man I think you are, then I know you're going to love it. Well, I've just designed a few different t-shirts and sweaters, etc. that really reflect our shared interest in British military history. I'll be adding more designs over the next few weeks, so check out the links below or scan the QR codes that are currently on the screen. Every sale means an extra £2 or so for me to keep the channel and the podcast running. Okay guys, sorry for the interruption, let's get back to the film. Not sure what their next move should be, the mutineers decided to head to the nearby Mughal capital, Delhi. It was here that King Bahadur Shah had his throne, though over recent years his power had become minimal as that of the British had increased. The mutineers looked to him to lead them. Like many parts of India in that hot May of 1857, Delhi had been on edge for some time. But it was the arrival of a band of mutineers from Meerut early on the morning of the 11th of May that made things finally come to a head. Among the British officers of the East India Company's army in Delhi that day was a young 19-year-old subaltern called Edward Vibart. He was known to his friends as Butcher. He had just come to the small fortified main guard next to the Kashmir Gate when things took a turn for the worst. This is what he later wrote. On looking out into the open space in front of the church, a few cavalry troopers in their French grey uniforms were seen galloping back in the direction of the palace. Lieutenant Wilson brought a gun round to bear on them, but they were out of sight before he had time to fire. As for the men of my own regiment, I could not imagine what had become of them. Not a sepoy was to be seen, they'd all vanished. A consultation was now held to decide what was best to be done. At length, it was determined to hold the main guard, and for this purpose the 2 guns were placed in position at the gates which commanded the approach from the palace and swept the open ground in front. Some of our sepoys were drawn up in support, whilst others were sent to man the ramparts and bastion and keep a sharp lookout on every side. I may here mention that the guard of the 38th Native Infantry on duty had, just before our arrival, refused to fire on the cavalry mutineers when called upon to do so by Captain Wallet and Lieutenant Proctor. They even taunted these officers in mutinous language and said that now the time had arrived to take their revenge on people who had tried, as they asserted, to subvert their caste and religion. Our position here then can easily be imagined to have been of an exceedingly precarious nature. At length some of us advanced beyond the inner gate, when the first thing I saw was the lifeless body of Captain Burrows lying close by the gate of the churchyard. Assisted by a couple of sepoys, I carried him into the main guard and laid him on a charpoy, which is like a little bed. Other bodies were now observed scattered about the place. 5 were at length found and brought in. I shall never forget my feelings that day as I saw our poor fellows being brought in, their faces distorted with all the agonies of a violent death, hacked about in every conceivable way. But we had no time to indulge in sad reflections, for reports now reached us that besides the 3rd Cavalry Troopers, 2 regiments of native infantry, the 11th and 20th, had also arrived from Meerut and were on their way to attack us. The entire city was now in uproar. One after another the local regiments were called out to crush the mutiny, and one after another they refused. Christians of all colours, whether local or European, were cut down in the streets. As an interesting aside, one thing I did learn in my research is that white Muslim converts were spared, and some of them went on to fight alongside the mutineers. As the chaos developed, there was one very important building that the mutineers were determined to capture.
So behind me, that archway is all that's left of the old Delhi magazine, the largest in northern India as it was at the start of the Indian Mutiny in 1857. Packed with muskets, powder and cannonballs, it was the scene of a bitter fight at the start of the mutiny. It was also where the oldest ever recipient of the Victoria Cross earned his award. It's an unloved, unlooked after spot this. I'm literally kneeling in what's clearly where druggies have been doing their stuff. It's not pleasant. I wouldn't recommend visiting for the faint of heart, but for those of us who love military history, it's worth the effort.
Lieutenant George Willoughby of the Bengal Artillery was in command here. Willoughby has been described as shy and undistinguished, but what happened at the magazine is the stuff of legends. At the first sign of trouble, he ordered his tiny garrison of 8 other Europeans and a handful of sepoys to barricade the gates. To make his job more difficult, the sepoys who were there were already showing signs of mutinous behaviour. It wasn't looking good. Amongst the men present was Lieutenant William Rayner. He was 61 years old and had been in India with the East India Company's army since 1812. Another of the men was Lieutenant George Forrest. He later wrote, "Inside the gate leading to the park were placed 2 6-pounders, double charged with grape, one under Subconductor Crow and Sergeant Stewart, with the lighted matches in their hands and with orders that if any attempt was made to force that gate, both guns were to be fired at once and they were to fall back on the part of the magazine in which Lieutenant Willoughby and I were posted. The principal gate of the magazine was similarly defended by 2 guns with chevaux de frise laid down on the inside." Chevaux de frise were like defensive obstacles with swords or spikes, that sort of thing, almost a bit like modern day barbed wire. At that moment, the mutineers arrived in force, demanding that the magazine surrender. Their offer was ignored, and the local troops in the magazine now abandoned their posts and joined the enemy as the attack commenced. Forrest continues his account. "We kept up an incessant fire of grape on them, every round of which told well, as long as a single round remained. Previous to the natives deserting us, they hid the priming pouches, and one man in particular, Kareem Buksh, appeared to keep up a constant communication with the enemy on the outside and keep them informed of our situation. Lieutenant Willoughby was so annoyed at this man's conduct that he gave me an order to shoot him should he again approach the gate. Lieutenant Rayner with the other Europeans did everything that possibly could be done for the defence of the magazine, and where all have behaved so bravely it is almost impossible for me to point out any particular individual. A train of powder was then laid with a view to blowing the place sky high if it looked like it was about to fall. Fighting raged until the weight of sepoy fire began to take its toll on the defenders.
As the rebels finally came over the walls, realising their situation was hopeless, the defenders decided to blow up the magazine.
A crash of thunder followed. Hundreds of shells and powder barrels shook the entire city as they exploded. Historian Saul David says probably 25 sepoys and up to 400 local civilian onlookers were killed by the explosion. 3 of the defenders were also blown up, including Conductor Scully, who lit the match. I mean, what a ballsy bugger. He must have known that he was going to die in that explosion, but he was willing to do it because of his duty.
It's hard to believe that such a small force defending this place was able to mount such a spirited and brave defence.
What I find very surprising is that any of the defenders actually survived, and some of them even managed to get back to safety. Okay, let's go back to Edward Vibart's account again. He was still busy at the main gate, but he heard what happens and he later wrote, "About 4 p.m. guns were heard booming in the direction of the magazine, but no one could conjecture what had happened. We were not long, however, kept in suspense, for after some 30 rounds had been fired in rapid succession, a terrific explosion rent the air, shaking the foundations of the main guard to its centre. Bugles were blown, the assembly sounded, and all was confusion and dismay. Everybody rushing here and there, some pacifying the ladies, others trying to get the men together, none of us knowing what to make of it. Presently a dense column of smoke and dust ascended to an immense height, and we rightly guessed that the magazine was blown up. A few minutes subsequent to the explosion, Lieutenant Willoughby, the commissary of ordnance in charge of the magazine, and Lieutenant Forrest, his assistant, made their appearance. The former begrimed with dust and powder, and the latter badly wounded in the hand from a musket ball. From them we learned the particulars of their defence of the magazine, a defence which perhaps it is no exaggeration to say has scarcely a parallel in history." It's a hell of a statement, isn't it? It really puts it into context. 3 of the survivors were awarded the Victoria Cross for their actions. Amongst them, of course, Lieutenant Forrest and Lieutenant Rayner, that 61-year-old, 61 years and 10 months. That makes him the oldest ever recipient of the Victoria Cross, a record that I think is highly unlikely ever to be beaten. Rayner was later promoted captain, and he actually survived the mutiny, dying in Ferozpur in 1860. His grave still exists, but according to my research online, it's in very poor condition. A number of the other defenders, including of course Conductor Scully, would have won the Victoria Cross, but in those days it couldn't be awarded posthumously. Only the survivors were able to get the award.
Next to the old Delhi magazine is this memorial. It's the Telegraph Monument, and it commemorates the last telegraph sent from Delhi that warned the rest of the country about what was coming, that the rebellion was here. It was very important. It's quite hard to read the inscription on there. Something about Charles Todd.
Todd was actually the master of the telegraph office, and he was killed on the 11th of May when he set out to fix what he thought was a break in the line. Later in the day, one of his staff, J.W. Pilkington, who had already managed to take shelter at the Flagstaff Tower on Delhi Ridge, volunteered to go and send one last telegraph from the office. The message he sent said, "Cantonment in a state of siege. Mutineers from Meerut, 3rd Light Cavalry, numbers not known, said to be 150 men, cut off communication. 54th Native Infantry sent against them, refused to act. Several officers killed and wounded. City in a state of considerable excitement. Troops sent down but nothing known yet. Information will be forwarded." It was later said that this message saved British India. It informed other cities what was happening, and in some cases allowed them time to disarm potentially mutinous sepoy regiments. Meanwhile, the ordeal for those Europeans still in Delhi was far from over. Some did manage to survive, travelling for days and through the night to escape. Even those lucky enough not to be killed were usually robbed of all their belongings by locals on the road. So rebel soldiers were now in charge in Delhi, and they were able to persuade the King Bahadur Shah to side with them, to be their leader. But he was a nominal head and didn't really have any power. He was a man very much caught between a rock and a hard place, and if you want to know more about him, I do recommend the works of William Dalrymple. So what had started as a small-scale mutiny in Meerut was now spreading. Delhi was controlled by the mutineers. Things were not looking good for the British. Could this be the end of the East India Company's control of India?
After Delhi had fallen to the mutineers there in the middle of May 1857, it became the hub of the mutiny. It was here where a large proportion of those mutineers made their base of operations during that long hot summer.
It was home to the Mughal emperor, the last in his line, King Bahadur Shah II. And that's one of the reasons why it became this spiritual home of the mutiny. But the British were determined not to give up so easily. It was decided that Delhi must be retaken at all costs. But there weren't many forces to do so. Just a handful of regiments spread across northern India, massively outnumbered by the mutineers. There was also a very limited supply of experienced commanding officers. General Anson, the commander-in-chief, was up at Simla when the mutiny broke out. On the 14th of May, he left for Umballa, where he gathered together what forces he could find. There was the 9th Lancers, the 75th Stirlingshire Regiment of Foot, and the 1st and 2nd Bengal Europeans. The logistical challenges that Anson faced were enormous. In fact, it seemed very unlikely that he could achieve anything with his small force in the face of a huge growing number of mutineers. But, as good British officers do with the odds stacked against them, they still marched towards the enemy. They headed towards Delhi. Amarpal Singh is a well-known historian, friend of the show, and he's written a book about the siege of Delhi. I wanted his opinion on why Delhi was so important to the British. Why did they want to recapture it?
Delhi was the imperial capital of the Mughal Empire. Although it didn't have that strategic value, if you like, it had a huge political value, and it had that sort of prestige and status as well.
But there was another, even more practical reason.
The British actually had 3 arsenals in North India. So one was in Delhi. From that point of view, it was very important for either side. You know, if you look at the British or the rebels, the sepoys, it was very important for either of them to retain control of that city.
En route to Delhi, Anson's small force combined with what was left of the Meerut garrison, including the elite troops of the 60th Rifles. But soon the strain of leading this small force proved too much for General Anson, and he died of cholera on the 27th of May. He was replaced by General Henry Barnard. He was a veteran of the Crimean War, but he was inexperienced in India. As the army continued their march towards Delhi, they looked for revenge wherever they could, hanging anybody they suspected of being a mutineer or of helping the mutineers. And it wasn't long until Barnard's small force, numbering around 3,000 men, fought its first major battle against the mutineers at a place called Badli Ki Sarai. It's a spot about 6 miles outside of Delhi. The mutineers were well dug in, blocking the route along the Grand Trunk Road. It's hard to say exactly how many mutineers there were. Some books claim as many as 30,000, which seems probably too many. Other books more realistically claim around 4,000. What we do know is that these Indian defenders outnumbered the British substantially, and they had more and heavier caliber guns. If the British were to lose this battle, it's likely the war might be lost. The pressure was on. In India, since the time of Lord Clive, as anybody who follows this show will know, the British had always believed in taking the initiative and going on to the attack. And that's exactly what they did here against superior numbers. A brutal but successful bayonet charge by the 75th Regiment of Foot took the Indian guns and swept through the walled compound at the centre of the sepoy defence. Then, as the sepoys began to fall back, they were struck in the flank by the cavalry. Lieutenant Kendall Coghill of the 2nd Bengal Fusiliers wrote at the time, "About 3,000 of the enemy's infantry, some cavalry and horse artillery bolted across towards our lines on the left and met the 60th Rifles and 2nd Fusiliers, who gave them a few well-directed volleys and then ceased firing, for, close in their rear, a wing of our 9th Lancers charged across, cut up a lot and captured 2 guns. It was then our turn for the sport. So the left brigade, ours, brought its left round, went through a large jungle or forest, killed all we found, went through a large village, rooted them out and potted them and then fired again. We then turned their guns on them, gave them a few rounds of grape into the retiring mass, and by 9:30 that position was ours."
It was a very important battle, simply because it was the first major battle. Unfortunately for the mutineers, they didn't put up a particularly good show, and there were reasons for that. Lack of leadership. They had no real officers with experience of command. In fact, the battle shouldn't really have even taken place. If the mutineers had had some officer with military knowledge, they should have really stopped the British from coming as close to Delhi as that, really. In fact, I've got a little snippet here of John Lawrence sort of summing up the battle, if you like. He said, the quote, the advance of our troops toward Delhi and the victory at Badli Ki Sarai near that city on the 8th June proved to the country that there was vitality in our cause and power on our side. And that pretty much sums it up, really. It was a very first battle between the two sides, and it showed the country that, the British weren't dead. They had a chance of retaining the country.
Despite their victory, Barnard knew they needed to push on and allowed his men just 30 minutes rest before continuing their advance. On the edge of Delhi is a ridge that overlooks the city. Here, another force of mutineers had positioned themselves, but they were quickly forced out by another swift British attack. Some of Barnard's men now begged him to attack the city immediately, to seize the initiative and not to wait. He refused. Was that the right decision?
There were a couple of options. There were existing tunnels underneath the city walls, which were known to the British, and these could be used, or simply, a straightforward attack, try and blow up the city gates and then just simply enter. So there was a number of advantages to that. The British had the momentum at this stage anyway. The only disadvantage with that was that Barnard didn't have enough troops. He only had about 1,800 infantrymen available at this time. 1,800 men in a large city just isn't enough to really be able to do the job. So he decided to play safe, essentially, and decided to simply wait for reinforcements, which he knew would come because John Lawrence was promising him extra troops as soon as he could as soon as he could manage to send some.
And so the city was to be besieged. There would be no immediate attack. The British began to dig in on Delhi Ridge, not far from the old cantonments. For those watching on YouTube, this is how the ridge looks today. So I'm looking down now towards where the Kashmir Gate is. This is the view the British besieging force would have had towards the old city.
Okay, well, it was actually a very strong position, and I don't think the mutineers realised, the advantage of that position that they'd given away so cheaply. It's actually protected on three sides. So the only side that the mutineers could attack from was the southwest through the Sabzi Mandi. The other thing was that it was very close to the city. So just outside the range of the sepoy guns, but close enough to be able to attack the city as well. And of course, the other advantage was that it was north of the city. So any supplies coming from the Punjab could be protected, essentially. So you could easily send reinforcements up and down the road to the Punjab to protect those things coming in. And before I forget, very important, the canal provided fresh water for the British troops as well. And that was very important during the long, hot summer, because there's no wells in the cantonments.
Soon after the siege began, the British force began to get some reinforcements. One of the first units to arrive was the famous Corps of Guides. These hardy frontiersmen had marched 580 miles in around 22 days. In the heat of summer and during Ramadan, and most of them were Muslim. So that gives you an idea of how tough these fellows were. They, alongside the hardy Gurkhas, were to be heroes during this war. They were to really prove their worth. So let's pause for a moment and ask, why did the Gurkha units stay loyal to the British while the Bengal army was rebelling all around them? Here's friend of the show, Josh Proven.
Well, first of all, we know that they're not technically native infantry. Not only do the Gurkhas know this, but the Bengal sepoys know this, and they are not shy about showing it either. It's very much a symbiotic, if that's the right word, relationship of difference here. So you already have that. Then you add to that the fact that the Highlanders of Nepal have very little in common with the plainsmen of the Bengal and wider Hindustan. In fact, if anything, they're the enemies of the plain. They don't look like the people down there. They don't think like them. They have different ways of doing things. They despise them as each despises the other as lesser. So there's a hefty bit of racism here from the Himalayas down and back up. The Gurkhas quickly due to this sort of exceptionalism that was just inherent in how they were organized, fostered a very strong regimental identity through traditions through 40 years from 1815 to 1857-ish, I believe, of service. And they referred to the Bengal army as the Kala Log, which means black people, or the Purbayas, which means people from the east, I believe. And these were distinctive separating terms to show that we're not like them. In fact, it got to a point by the Sikh Wars in the 1840s that the European officers of the Gurkhas, who are still local battalions, took pride in the fact they did not have NI after the regimental designation, and would be insulted if they were ever called native infantry. It was a matter of regimental pride that we're Gurkhas, we're not native infantry. They request now and again to be encamped nearer the British, and when the Cartridge crisis occurred, for instance, they went out of their way, I think, on one occasion, at least so regimental tradition states, that they return, because the Cartridge situation was resolved and they issued new cartridges, but the Gurkhas gave back the reissued new cartridges and asked for the tainted ones back to show that they didn't have a problem in the first place with any cartridge they were given to use. They thought it was unsoldierly to be messing around with this. It's a cartridge, you fire it, it's, it is what it is. And so when the mutiny came out, they had nothing in common with the Bengal sepoys. They had no, unlike the rest of the army that was able to, through its messes and sort of its own regimental systems, spread the word quite quickly and have these mutiny sort of little governments like the ones that Mangal Pandey used and things like that. They had no in with the Gurkhas. I mean, they didn't even speak the language. Really, they would have to go through a different route, and there was no door open to get the Gurkhas on their side. So the Gurkhas stayed with the British.
Meanwhile, inside the city, the mutineers had their own problems. Let's hear more.
First of all, they weren't really particularly organised. You had sepoy regiments coming in sort of dribs and drabs, if you like, into Delhi. Each regiment effectively looked after its own supplies and ammunition. And one of the things that British spies reported on from the city was that there was very little actual cooperation between the regiments. In fact, there was a lot of jealousy, sort of almost rivalry, if you like. One regiment who brought supplies and ammunition and guns in effectively kept these guns to themselves, and including the ammunition as well. But having said that, morale was pretty high. I mean, these guys could see more and more mutinies happening, up and down the country. There were a lot of mutineers sort of making their way to the city. So even though they weren't having too much joy, in attacking the British position, there was this feeling that eventually they would do it, simply through, sheer weight of numbers, if you like.
But as the siege dragged on and casualties began to grow, life in the British camp became almost unbearable.
So there's all sorts of dead animals lying around for miles, casualties, lying everywhere from both sides. And cholera broke out in the British camp as well. So that made things even worse. But I think the biggest problem was probably the actual conditions during summer. In fact, I'll give you a quote from one of the British captains at the Ridge, which pretty much sums up the situation in the British camp. Quote, "The heat was insupportable. The thermometer under the shade of my tent marked 112 degrees Fahrenheit. And to add to our misery, there came upon us a plague of flies, the like of which I verily believe had not been on the earth since Moses in that manner brought down the wrath of God on the Egyptians. The air was tainted with corruption and the heat was intense. Can it then be wondered that pestilence increased daily in the camp, claiming its victims from every regiment, native as well as European?"
It was a strange sort of siege in a way. The besiegers pretty much besieged themselves, outnumbered and outgunned. Only good old-fashioned British pluck kept them in the fight. But that couldn't last forever. Even senior officers were falling like flies. General Barnard died of cholera on the 5th of July. His successor then almost immediately fell ill and handed over command to Archdale Wilson. He was an ageing artillery officer who was seen by many of his men as a plodder, not cut out for the deadly work ahead. But the siege continued to grind onwards. Every day there was heavy fighting. The sepoys would come out of the city and attack the British strongpoints. Each regiment that came in would decide they wanted to prove themselves with an attack. As casualties mounted for the British, reinforcements were desperately needed. And there was one obvious place where the British could turn. It was a place they had not long fought themselves, but where the men were warriors and also really disliked those Hindu sepoys. The Punjab.
It was very easy for the British to actually gain recruits from the Punjab, not just from the Sikh community, but from the Hindus as well, and especially from the Muslims. You know, the Muslims in the west of Punjab, you know, right up to Peshawar and Kashmir and Banu provinces, had an absolute total dislike of the Hindu sepoys, if you like.
Another warrior in the Punjab also now began to make his way to Delhi, the talismanic John Nicholson. He was a general in the East India Company Army, an Irishman and an Old India hand. He's one of the most fascinating characters of British Indian history. A man lauded at the time and seen as a great hero, but now hated, I would say, by a lot of modern revisionist historians. William Dalrymple calls him an imperial psychopath. But what does Amarpal think of the man?
He did use capital punishment quite a lot. My personal view is that that sort of attitude was, you know, essential where he was situated. So he was actually deputy for Herbert Edwards in Banu province, in very close to Peshawar. You know, as anyone knows, in that area, you know, you need to keep control. So he used capital punishment quite liberally. But that's what everybody did. You know, the Sikh governors prior to, you know, the British taking over Punjab did the same as well. So, yeah, he does get a lot of bad press these days, but I don't think he was any different from, you know, a lot of people that went before him and people that came after him as well.
But whatever you think of the rights and wrongs of the man, he soon proved himself in the field of battle with a great victory at Najafgarh on the 25th of August.
Najafgarh is a few miles to the west of Delhi. The mutineers decided to try and stop the siege train, and so they marched to the west of Delhi to try and bypass the British force at the ridge. Unfortunately for them, the British realised this move, and Nicholson was sent to actually intercept the sepoys. Both sides met at Najafgarh. Nicholson caught them by surprise, pretty much, and the battle was a fairly short one and a very decisive one as well, actually. In fact, it was so decisive that, you know, he managed to capture the mutineers' baggage and pretty much all the guns as well. And after this date, you'll find that a lot of the sepoys simply started deserting, sort of almost realising that the battle was over. Morale was absolutely low at this point for them.
So thanks to his excellent victory at Najafgarh, the siege train, those heavy guns that were coming down from Punjab, were now able to reach Delhi. It was very important.
Without the siege train at Delhi, the British could not have recaptured Delhi. They just did not have enough heavy guns that, with them at that time to be able to make the breaches in the walls. The siege train roughly doubled the amount of guns that the British had at the ridge at that time.
And so, with their new guns and reinforcements streaming in, the scene was becoming set for a final showdown. But attacking the city was never going to be easy. Wilson, understandably in a way, was wary. If he threw everything at the assault and it failed, his own camp could fall, the war would be lost.
Wilson could only count on about 8,000 men, 8,000 fit men. Now, that may have been okay out in the field against the mutineers, but attacking a city is a difficult proposition. You have to get through the gates, get through the breaches, but once you're in the city, it's a very difficult situation. Each house effectively becomes a fortress, and anyone who's seen houses in India will know that they're very difficult to enter. All houses have, or in those days used to have, heavy wooden doors, bars on the windows. So if you've got a few mutineers on the roof just shooting down at you, taking pot shots, it's very difficult to actually get to them. You need a gun to literally break into each house. So very difficult situation. What Wilson was worried about was that, if the mutineers did have an organized defense, his whole, the columns that would attack the city would be literally cut to ribbons on the first day.
But despite Wilson's fears, the pressure from men like Nicholson wore him down, and he finally decided to act. As anyone who knows about siege warfare will tell you, the key is to make a breach through the walls. And so the first thing Wilson did was move his guns closer, to dig the batteries in and to start hammering the walls to try and make that breach, that gap in the wall, that would become what they call practicable, which means the infantry could then assault. On the 13th of September, a young engineer officer called Arthur Moffat Lang was ordered to go and inspect the breach and see if it was big enough. Showing balls of steel, he pretty much climbed onto the walls in daylight, right under the noses of the mutineers. It was practicable, he decided. The decision was made to attack. Soon, thousands of desperate men would be throwing themselves at the walls in one of the most brutal and compelling battles of the Victorian era. So was the decision to attack the right one?
I think the decision was taken for him. He was given orders to take Delhi as soon as possible. And the British force had already sat outside Delhi for over 3 months. There was a danger that Punjab would actually rebel itself. A lot of the communities that were helping the British were, beginning to realize that, if the British are having problems capturing Delhi, then, why can't we rebel ourselves and, regain independence, if you like. So there was this situation where, if Delhi did not fall within a few days, then Punjab would fall as well. And if Punjab fell, then, the whole situation was completely changed.
The attack itself was to comprise 4 assault columns with 1 in reserve. There was the first column under Brigadier General Nicholson. He was the hero of the army, a fire-eater who had defeated the rebels at Najafka just days earlier. His 1,000 men were tasked with storming the breach at the Kashmir Bastion. The second column, which was commanded by Brigadier William Jones, was to clear the breach at the water tower, while the third column under Colonel Campbell was to flood through the Kashmir Gate as soon as it was blown open by the engineers. The fourth column under Major Reid of the Simor Battalion of the Gurkhas was to operate on the right flank. Its job was to battle through the suburbs and then effect an entrance at the Kabul Gate. The fifth column or reserve column was to wait and be ready to assist wherever required. Each column only numbered about 1,000 men. Would that be enough to storm such a big city? The attack was meant to begin at dawn, but it was daylight by the time the columns were in position. Arthur Moffat Lang was a 20-year-old engineer with Nicholson's column. He recalled, "First rushed on number 3, heads low and stooping forward and running and cheering under showers of grape and musketry. Then came Nicholson, with me and my party of 250 fusiliers with ladders. At the Custom House Road, we turned to the left and made up the glacis to the right face of the bastion. It was most gloriously exciting. The bullets seemed to pass like a hissing sheet of lead over us, and the noise of the cheering was so great that I nearly lost my men, who doubled too far down the road before I could get to them. So they got more fire on the glacis than they needed. The edge of the ditch reached down. We slipped. Just as I slid down on my left, I saw Medley and the 75th beginning to swarm their breach, and on my right I saw a column of smoke ascend and heard the explosion of the blowing in of the Kashmir Gate. The Kashmir Gate was over to Moffat's right. Here the sappers had to lead the way." It's almost impossible to comprehend the bravery of those brave engineers led by Lieutenants Holm and Sackold. They were a mixed bag, both Indian and British, and they came forward nonchalantly under a hail of fire. There was a young subaltern who saw everything that day. His name was Fred Roberts. You may know the name. He went on to become a field marshal. He wrote this about what he witnessed. "Number 3 column had in the meanwhile advanced towards the Kashmir Gate and halted. Lieutenants Holm and Salkold with 8 sappers and miners and a bugler of the 52nd Foot went forward to blow the gate open. The enemy were apparently so astounded at the audacity of this proceeding that for a minute or two they offered but slight resistance. They soon, however, discovered how small the party was and the object for which it had come, and forthwith opened a deadly fire upon the gallant little band from the top of the gateway, from the city wall and through the open wicket. The bridge over the ditch in front of the gateway had been destroyed, and it was with some difficulty that a single beam which remained could be crossed. Holm, with the men carrying the powder bags, got over first. As the bags were being attached to the gate, Sergeant Carmichael was killed and Havildar Madhu wounded. The rest then slipped into the ditch to allow the firing party, which had come up under Salkold, to carry out its share of the duty. While endeavouring to fire the charge, Salcold, being shot through the leg and arm, handed the slow match to Corporal Burgess, who fell mortally wounded, but not until he had successfully performed his task. As soon as the explosion had taken place, bugler Hawthorne sounded the regimental call of the 52nd. So despite those intense casualties, the engineers had done their job. The gate was blown, the bugler sounded the advance, and the storming parties came forward under the arches here. As the third column advanced down these narrow alleyways, they took heavy fire. As you can see, these streets are still narrow now, and they were more narrow then. It was brutal fighting as they tried to force their way through to the Jama Masjid. Just behind Kashmir Gate is the oldest church in Delhi.
It was built by James Skinner. Fascinating character, and I wanted to do an entire film on him and this church and the history of his regiment, Skinner's Horse. But it's closed for renovation.
So as the fighting raged, things didn't go strictly to plan. It was bitter, close-quarter fighting, the hardest type. The columns became confused, casualties mounted. The fourth column on the right of the assault had been repulsed. Nicholson, realising that the attack was in danger of failing, was determined to maintain the momentum and capture the burned bastion.
Nicholson, as brave as a lion as always, walked calmly down the street waving his sword in the air. As he turned back to wave on the rest of the men, he got shot under the armpit. A sergeant nearby caught him and with great effort pulled him to cover nearby.
Nicholson wouldn't be moved, insisting he would rather die where he fell. But eventually he relented and Indian bearers were ordered to carry him back to the field hospital, a task that wasn't finished.
And so his dooli was abandoned here by the gate, his bearers running off to do some looting while they had the chance. Nicholson was found later, his face a mask of pain.
He was discovered by fellow officers a little later and eventually taken to the hospital. But was the attack now doomed to failure?
Well, street fighting is always difficult, simply because you have to capture buildings, you have to capture houses. Anyone who's been to India will know that the houses are very well built. And of course, while the British troops are trying to break in, you can have sepoys, snipers, on the roofs, just taking, pot shots at the British troops and just picking them off. So it looked really difficult. And Wilson, in fact, wanted to retire from the city. That he thought it best to just come out and just reorganize. But he asked his officers, he asked Hope Grant, he asked several other officers, and in fact he sent an officer to ask Nicholson as well what he thought. Should we pull out or should we stay in the city? And all of them told him, look, we've got to stay in the city. If we start pulling out now, it'll be a disaster.
Young Edward Vibart, a Bengal Army subaltern who we met in an earlier episode, was involved in the fighting with the Bengal Fusiliers, and he wrote, "We were chiefly engaged in working cautiously through the streets and sapping gradually from house to house, in the course of which we frequently found ourselves on one side of a brick wall with the enemy facing us on the other. The modus operandi was as follows. The engineers would first break through a wall of a house, which we at once proceeded to occupy, and then, carrying sandbags to the top of the roof, would construct a parapet, from behind which a covering fire was kept upon the next house to be taken. Occasionally some awkward street fighting took place amongst the numerous narrow streets and tortuous lanes which abound in the native city of Delhi." So one of the biggest problems faced by the British officers was something Wellington and his commanders in the peninsula would certainly know all about.
When the British broke into the city, they found several large caches of drink in the city, alcohol. Being soldiers, they sort of immediately decided to take advantage. So you had a huge amount of drunkenness, if you like, by the end of the first day. And it's almost an indication of the sort of lack of organization of the sepoys, the fact that they couldn't take advantage of this sort of drunkenness and disorganization in the British ranks.
Despite those horrific first few hours trying to force the walls and the bitter street fighting that followed, the British were slowly getting the upper hand.
The resistance of the sepoys almost crumbled after the first day. And, somebody compares it to like a balloon being, pricked by a pin, if you like, So on the first day, there was a very heavy resistance by the sepoys, but they lost morale as well very quickly. And, You had thousands of them streaming out the city from the south of the city after the first day as well.
So even though a lot of the sepoy regiments were losing heart and pulling out of Delhi, there was still a lot of hard fighting to be done because there were thousands and thousands of volunteers, mainly Islamic jihadis, who'd come to fight their holy war against the British. Hard fights saw the British troops work their way through the city. Eventually they captured the magazine and the Jama Masjid mosque. The last Mughal king, Bahadur Shah Zafar, the figurehead of the mutineers, finally abandoned the Red Fort, and that as well fell to the British. He was later captured and imprisoned. A number of his children were even executed out of hand. And so, on the evening of the 20th of September, the battle for Delhi was over. Modern historians, and I'm thinking especially William Dalrymple here, whose book is excellent by the way about the last Mughal king and the Battle of Delhi, they do talk a lot about the British brutality when the city was captured. But how bad was it? I asked Amapol.
Well, I think it could have been a lot worse. Wilson had given orders to prevent any kind of, atrocities from taking place. Now, that doesn't mean that there wasn't any, but it certainly could have been a lot worse. A lot of the people had actually managed to make their way out of the city in any case. The British were attacking from the north. The city gates to the south were open. So a lot of people were actually, fleeing to the south and managing to flee quite successfully.
And there was still time for one more tragedy. John Nicholson, badly wounded on the 14th, as you'll recall, finally died of his wounds on the 23rd of September. The cemetery, a quick walk from the Kashmir Gate, is still named after Nicholson. It's a little overgrown, but generally is in good condition and well worth a visit if you're in Delhi.
So this is Nicholson Christian Cemetery, where John Nicholson himself is buried. From this angle and with the age of the stone, I can't really read the inscription, but I did read that the marble slab over his grave was once a marble seat for the King of Delhi, I believe from his garden. This rather dilapidated grave right at the back of the cemetery says it's for the sacred memory of Alexander William Murray, Lieutenant 42nd Regiment Bengal Native Light Infantry, and attached during the siege of Delhi to the famous cause of guides, I added the word famous there, who fell whilst encouraging his men to follow his brave example on the 14th of September 1857, I think that says. It's very damaged. So buried somewhere here is a fellow Leicester lad, Victoria Cross winner at the siege of Delhi, Everard Phillips. The problem is I just can't find his grave. As an aside, Phillips was awarded his VC 50 years after his death. It was awarded for, quote, many gallant deeds which he performed during the siege of Delhi, during which he was wounded 3 times. At the assault of that city, he captured the water bastion with a small party of men and was finally killed in the streets of Delhi on the 18th of September. So Delhi was now back in British hands, but what about the rest of the country? Let's travel slightly northeast to the town of Cawnpore. Cawnpore was a key city for the East India Company forces, situated as it was on both the Ganges River and the Grand Trunk Road that led from Calcutta in the east of India, the British capital, to Kabul in Afghanistan. In early May 1857, the garrison of the town consisted of the 1st, 53rd and 56th Native Infantry, the 2nd Light Cavalry and 2 companies of Indian artillerymen. There were only a handful of white European troops, including about 70 invalids from the 32nd Cornwall Regiment of Foot. There was also 61 gunners with 6 guns. That meant the European contingent were outnumbered by about 17 to 1. That number did slightly improve just before the fighting began in early June, when a number of soldiers from the 84th Regiment of Foot arrived, as well as a handful of Madras Fusiliers, which was a regiment of Europeans in the service of the East India Company's army. The garrison was commanded by Major General Sir Hugh Wheeler, an old-school East India Company officer. Cool and courageous, he was a veteran of the invasion of Afghanistan, the First Afghan War, and also the wars against the Sikhs, where he'd really proved himself. Wheeler spoke fluent Hindi and was married to a mixed race woman called Frances. He was 67 years old though, he was getting on a bit, and he'd served in India for nearly 50 years. News of the mutiny at Meerut and Delhi reached Wheeler on the 14th of May, and soon afterwards he ordered the construction of a defensive position around 2 large barracks at the centre of the cantonments. It was hard ground and difficult to dig in, but eventually an entrenchment of around 9 acres was dug.
It wasn't much of a fortress, but was designed simply as a temporary bastion to defend any local Europeans in the event of an uprising. It was expected that if the Indian soldiers did mutiny, they would go straight to Delhi. Therefore, the entrenchment was never expected to be a long-term solution, to be a fortified position to withstand a long siege. At this point, Wheeler was playing a difficult and dangerous game, trying to keep his sepoys happy and appear comfortable in their company, while also planning how to defeat them if they did mutiny. Like many of his officers, he had his own wife and children with him. This must have been incredibly stressful. It's one thing to fight a battle alongside your men, it's another to know your wife and kids are right behind you. What a terrible element of stress that must have added to everybody there. Mowbray Thompson was an officer of the 53rd Native Infantry. He was one of just a handful of Europeans to survive the upcoming siege. In his memoir, he recalls the night that the mutiny began in earnest at Cawnpore. At length the much dreaded explosion came. On the night of the 6th of June, the 2nd Cavalry broke out. They first set fire to the riding master's bungalow and then fled, carrying off with them horses, arms, colours and the regimental treasure chest. The old Subadar major of the regiment defended the colours and treasure, which were in the quarter guard, as long as he could, and the poor old fellow was found in the morning severely wounded and lying in his own blood at his post. This was the only instance of any native belonging to that regiment who retained his fidelity. The old man remained with us and was killed by a shell in the entrenchment. An hour or two after the flight of the cavalry, the 1st Native Infantry also bolted, leaving their officers untouched upon the parade ground. The 56th Native Infantry followed the next morning. The 53rd remained till, by some error of the general, they were fired into. What Thompson's referring to here is an incident where the 53rd was seen assembling, and Wheeler, at the end of his tether, decided to order his guns to fire upon them. The officers of that regiment felt they should have been given a chance and that they would have remained staunch. Personally, I'm not sure that they would. To be fair, though, a number of sepoys at Cawnpore did stay loyal to the East India Company's army, and a number of them were killed defending the entrenchment. As with everything to do with the mutiny, it's pretty complicated. It's not as simple as them versus us, whites against Indians. No, it really isn't. Okay, so the wait was now finally over. The fighting was about to begin. There was about 300 men in the entrenchment and about 500 women and children, possibly a bit more, maybe as many as 900 people in total. The perimeter was about 1.5 miles long, with men deployed every 15 paces and working in shifts. After the initial mutiny, the Indian troops planned to set off for Delhi, as had been predicted, but on the way they were met by a local ruler called Nana Sahib. He was the adopted son of a Maratha king called Baji Rao. Because he was adopted, the East India Company had refused to allow him his father's pension, and therefore he had very strong reasons for hating the British. William Jonas Shepherd was working as a clerk. He was a mixed-race guy working as a clerk in Cawnpore when the outbreak began. He was also one of the few to survive and left us this account. He wrote that Nana told the mutineers he would double the amount of pay they received from the British government if they would agree to stay and fight, as by doing so they would get great praise and it would be a grand thing to gain a complete victory over the British at Cawnpore, that the King of Delhi would make much of them, and he himself, Nana, would reward each of them with a gold bracelet to each sepoy worth 100 rupees. With this offer, the sepoys decided to turn around and head right back to Cawnpore. The next morning at about 10:30, the battle began. Soon the rebels had set up 5 batteries, 14 guns in total, some of them very close. They were much heavier caliber than the garrison's small number of guns. The garrison was also forced to conserve ammunition, so it was very hard for them to win any of these artillery duels. Mowbray Thompson gives a good account of what it was like to be at the receiving end of one of these sepoy attacks. All through this first weary day, the shrieks of the women and children were terrific. As often as the balls struck the walls of the barracks, their wailings were heartrending. But after the initiation of that first day, they'd learnt silence and never uttered a sound except when groaning from the horrible mutilations they had to endure. When night sheltered them, our cowardly assailants closed in upon the entrenchments and harassed us with incessant volleys of musketry. Waiting the assault that we supposed to be impending, not a man closed his eyes in sleep. And throughout the whole siege, snatches of troubled slumber under the cover of the wall was all the relief the combatants could obtain. The ping-ping of rifle bullets would break short dreams of home or of approaching relief. Pleasant visions made horrible by waking to the state of things around. And if it were so with men of mature years, sustained by the fullness of physical strength, how much more terrible were the nights passed inside those barracks by our women and children. End quote. As the day wore on, those barracks that were at the heart of the defence and that housed the women and children began to take a lot of damage. The walls crumbled, there was holes in them, people inside were being killed. Casualties were growing. Not only that, but they were running low on food and water. The curse of any besieged force. But while the situation grew dire, one man amongst the defenders did really stand out. His name was Captain John Moore of Her Majesty's 32nd Regiment of Foot. It's in times like this that true character really comes out, and he showed his. The fact that he was in Cawnpore leading a detachment of invalids makes me wonder how highly thought of he was by his commanding officer. But he certainly proved himself during the siege. He was at the heart of everything, leading sallies against the attackers, spiking guns, and being there to give encouragement to the men at all hours. Thomson wrote of him, "Captain Moore was a tall, fair man with light blue eyes and, I believe, an Irishman by birth. Throughout all the harassing duties that devolved upon him, he never lost determination or energy. Though the little band of men at his direction were daily lessened by death, he was cheerful and animated to the last, and inspired all around him with a share of his wonderful endurance and vivacity. He visited every one of the pickets daily and sometimes 2 or 3 times a day, speaking words of encouragement to every one of us. His never-say-die disposition nerved many a sinking heart to the conflict, and his affable, tender sympathy imparted fresh patience to the suffering women." Moore was exactly the sort of man needed. Especially given the likes of Wheeler and some of the other senior officers were old and they were tired. They were suffering from exhaustion and depression. By June the 11th, the bombardment had intensified. The sepoys under Nana Sahib were determined to take the compound. It's said that at this point there was a shell landing every 8 seconds, some of them fired from as close as 350 yards. The sepoys launched another major attack on the 12th of June. Shepherd, who had already been wounded, recounts, "The din of this fearful cannonading and musketry was so incessant for nearly a couple of hours that it resembled continuous claps of thunder in a tremendous storm. It was an awful moment, a moment when death stared us on all sides and gave a foretaste of what might have been our fate on that occasion. All in the room had fallen to the ground in fervent and earnest supplications to our Almighty Father. A few well-directed charges of canister from our batteries served to keep them in check, and our men did pretty good execution with their musketry till the enemy's infantry left the field of battle and retired." The civilians suffered particularly heavily during this siege, as is always the case in war, sadly. There are so many stories of young children and pregnant women being amongst the killed and terribly wounded. For my research, I leant heavily on a book called Our Bones Are Scattered by Andrew Ward, and almost every page is packed with depressing stories of tragic death. It's a great book, but my gosh, it leaves a very bad taste in the mouth. But despite everything, Wheeler and the other officers were still hopeful that a relief force was going to come and save them. In fact, a relief column under Brigadier General Henry Havelock was being put together, but logistical problems meant that it was considerably delayed. One of its problems seems to have been that Colonel Neil of the Madras Fusiliers was a little bit overzealous in some of his dealings with the Indians. He disbanded a number of regiments that so far had shown no signs of mutiny, and on top of that he was very quick to execute anybody he thought could be talking to the mutineers. Meanwhile, Nana Sahib had his own problems. His army was a mixture of Hindu and Muslim troops. Sometimes they were at odds with one another. For example, there was a time when 2 Muslim butchers slaughtered a cow in the bazaar. They were then arrested and had their hands chopped off for this crime, which obviously goes against Hindu sensibilities. But when they had their hands chopped off, they actually bled to death and died. And this made some of the Muslim soldiers very angry, and they went to see Nana Sahib and gave him a piece of their mind. But he was able to keep the army together. At least their hatred of the Europeans, of the Christians, was more than their dislike for one another. The siege dragged on. What had been expected to be a few hours' work was now turning into weeks of hard fighting for these sepoys. It was turning into a costly stalemate. On June the 17th, another large attack was launched. It was repulsed, but at the loss of 50 casualties for the defenders. They just didn't have enough men to lose so many. That was followed by another big assault on the 22nd. The leaders of that attack had vowed to take the entrenchment or die trying. And many of them did die, for no result. The entrenchment withstood the attack. But despite being able to stand strong, those inside were at the end of their tether. So far, about 300 of them had been killed, including virtually all of the gunners, who were an incredibly important part of the defence.
The buildings were badly damaged, leaving them almost no cover. The heat was intense, beating down on them and literally sending people crazy. All the medicine had been destroyed, and water was a scarce resource, incredibly dangerous to fetch from the one well. In fact, there was even a small business people charging to go and fetch water for others, because that well was under constant enemy fire. But then, on the evening of June the 24th, something surprising happened. The defenders were shocked to see what appeared to be an elderly European lady hobbling across the open ground towards them. Turns out she was a prisoner of Nana Sahib and had been sent to the garrison to give them a letter with options for surrender. What followed was a complicated back and forth, a debate about signatures on the letter and many other things, but essentially the offer was there to take them in boats over to where the British still had a garrison at Allahabad. You can imagine the conversation that happened between those British officers about whether they should surrender or not. General Wheeler was understandably very reticent. He had been burnt by Nana, who he had trusted before the mutiny, and he no longer trusted anything the man said. But others had a different perspective. The argument for surrender actually came from a very surprising source, our hero, Captain Moore. He appealed that actually they should take a chance because the women and children were going to die anyway. At least if they did surrender, there was a chance they might survive. As Thompson later wrote, "All of us who were juniors adopted the views of the brave old general, but we well knew that it was only consideration for the weak and wounded that turned the vote against us. Had there been only men there, I'm sure we should have made a dash for Allahabad rather than have thought of surrender. And Captain Moore would have been the first to lead the forlorn hope. A braver soul than he never breathed." End quote. Finally, terms were agreed, and on the morning of June the 27th, the survivors left the entrenchment. Many of them were sick and wounded, and it was very slow going, heading down towards the Ganges River. Our old friend, Captain Moore, not surprisingly took the lead, leading the advanced party down towards the river. Sepoys and local civilians were hovering about everywhere. Some were friendly, some were very aggressive. Thompson later remembered, "Immediately after the exit of the first detachment, the place was thronged with sepoys. One of them said to one of our men, 'Give me that musket,' placing his hands upon the weapon as if about to take it. 'You shall have its contents if you please, but not the gun,' was the reply. The proposal not having been accepted, the insulted Briton walked off. It was the only semblance of an interruption to our departure. But despite generally a promising start, things soon began to deteriorate. With great difficulty, the boats were loaded, but the water level was very low, and it was a mammoth task to try and push them out into the river. As some of the officers struggled to do so, a bugle sounded, and suddenly, with no warning, the sepoys began to open fire, musketry and guns. Soon some of the boats were on fire. Thompson once more picks up the story. The scene which followed this manifestation of the infernal treachery of our assassins is one that beggars all description. Some of the boats presented a broadside to the guns, others were raked from stem to stern by the shot. Volumes of smoke from the thatch somewhat veiled the full extent of the horrors that morning. All who could move were speedily expelled from the boats by the heat of the flames. Alas, the wounded were burnt to death. One mitigation only there was to the horrible fate was that the flames were terribly fierce and their intense sufferings were not protracted. Wretched multitudes of women and children crouched behind the boats or waded out into the deeper water and stood up to their chins in the river to lessen the probability of being shot. Captain Moore was amongst those killed as he tried to push some of the boats out. So was Wheeler's beloved wife Frances. Boats were sunk and the noise was tremendous. It was now that some of the sepoys and some of the Sowars, those cavalrymen, waded out into the water and began killing the survivors. The scene's hard and painful to describe. Women and children were amongst those attacked with swords and bayonets. The river was soon red with blood. I did visit the site in 2006, though sadly I've got no video footage of it. It's very, very difficult to imagine it now because it's such a calm and serene site with people, children, teenagers playing. It's very sad to imagine what happened then, but it's nice to see that now it's being used by the locals. When I was there, it was a busy spot. After about an hour, the order was given to stop the killing, and any surviving women and children were picked up and taken away from the riverbank by the sepoys. Later on, when a relief force did finally get close to Cawnpore, those survivors were killed at a place called the Bibigar. It's another horrendous tragedy, and it's said that the sepoys who were ordered to do the killing were so disgusted that they refused, and so local butchers were ordered forward to do it.
When that British relief force finally did arrive in Cawnpore, they were shocked and disgusted at what they found. And that was part of the reason why the revenge that they wreaked was so hideous. As I said at the beginning of this, I don't want to dwell on the killings by either side, because it is very horrific. If you want more, read Andrew Ward's book. Meanwhile, while all this was happening at the riverbank, one boat, General Wheeler's, had managed to get away. But the Ganges isn't a good place for untrained boatmen to try and navigate. It was slow going, especially as they were taking incoming fire virtually the whole way as they tried to get down the river. Throughout the night and into the next day, the ordeal continued. Wheeler himself, having just seen his wife killed, was an exhausted and broken man, and Major Vibart, who's actually related to Edward Vibart, who we talked about in the Delhi episode, was forced to take command. Thompson survived a shot to the head and was very, very lucky to keep going, picks up the story once more. Our pursuers speedily discovered us and again opened with musketry on the boat, which was once more settled down deep on a sandbank. At 9 a.m, Major Vibart directed me with Lieutenant Delafosse, Sergeant Grady and 11 privates of the 84th and 32nd Regiments to wade to the shore and drive off the sepoys while they attempted to ease off the boat again. It was a forlorn enterprise. Maddened by desperation, we charged the crowd of sepoys and drove them back some distance until we were thoroughly surrounded by a mingled party of natives, armed and unarmed. We cut our way through these, bearing more wounds, but without the loss of a man, and reached the spot at which we had landed, but the boat was gone. Our first thought was that they had got loose again and were further down the stream, and we followed in that direction, but never saw either the boat or our doomed companions any more. Thompson and his men were now stranded and forced to fight their way over open ground to a nearby temple. Here he is again. As he was entering the temple, Sergeant Grady was shot through the head. I instantly set 4 of the men crouching down in the doorway with bayonets fixed and their muskets placed so as to form a cheval de frise in the narrow entrance. The mob came on helter-skelter in such maddening haste that some of them fell or were pushed onto the bayonets, and their transfixed bodies made the barrier impassable to the rest, upon whom we, from behind our novel defence, poured shot upon shot into the crowd. The attacking force, running out of ideas, then tried to dig their way through the walls, and when that failed, they set the temple on fire. It must have been horrific inside as the roof was burning. Here's Thompson again. I proposed to the men to sell their lives as dearly as possible. Delay would have been certain suffocation, so out we rushed. The burning wood terribly marred our bare feet, but it was no time to think of trifles. Jumping the parapet, we were in the thick of the rabble in an instant. We fired a volley and ran amuck with the bayonet. 7 of our number succeeded in reaching the bank of the river, and we first threw in our guns and then ourselves. The weight of ammunition we had in the pouches carried us under the water. While we were thus submerged, we escaped the first volley they fired. We slipped off the belts, rose again and swam, and by the time they had loaded a second time, there were only our heads for them to aim at. Amazingly, Thompson and 3 others managed to survive, and they swam 6 miles down the river where they were picked up by retainers working for a local Rajah who was still on the side of the British. The worst of their ordeal was now over. There were some other survivors, including Jonas Shepherd, who we heard about earlier in the episode. He managed to survive after he convinced Wheeler to let him go on an intelligence gathering mission outside the wire, so to speak. While there, he got caught and captured and taken prisoner, but was mistaken for a local and thus survived. 1 or 2 of the ladies also managed to survive, including one called Amy Horn and General Wheeler's own daughter, Margaret. This is another complicated and confusing story, I guess with many different perspectives. You could say they were both abducted by Muslim sowars of the cavalry, or you could say their lives were saved by those same men, which essentially they were. Either way, they were picked up at the side of the river and taken off by these men. Margaret never returned to European society. Instead, it's said she was ashamed of what had happened and spent the rest of her life living amongst Indians. Wheeler himself and the rest of those on board his boat, those who hadn't been there to collect Thompson after his fighting on land at the side of the Ganges River, were not lucky. Forced to surrender shortly after Thompson had left the boat, they were then taken back to Cawnpore. When they got back, a serious disagreement took place between different groups of rebels. A number of sepoys, particularly those who knew Wheeler and liked and respected him, didn't want to see these men killed. They just wanted them imprisoned. But a different group, mainly made up of irregular cavalrymen, mocked them for their empathy, and they insisted that they would kill them, and they did. All of the men were executed. Just down the road from Cawnpore is another city that was also at the heart of the rebellion and saw some of the heaviest fighting. Lucknow is a huge city in the Indian state of Uttar Pradesh, northeast of Delhi. In 1857, when the mutiny began, it had only recently been annexed by the East India Company and was a hotbed of anger, a place ripe for insurrection.
There was less than 1,000 British troops in the vicinity of Lucknow, and they were separated and spread out across the region. They were massively outnumbered by the sepoys.
In charge here was Brigadier General Sir Henry Montgomery Lawrence, Henry Lawrence as he's most commonly known. Like so many great British officers of the era, he was a tough Scots-Irishman. He was an experienced administrator who had served in the First Anglo-Burmese War before making his name in the Punjab. He had arrived in Lucknow in March 1857, just 2 months before the Sepoy Mutiny began. Lawrence lived here at the Residency, the place that is to be at the centre of today's story. It was a large building originally constructed in 1780. Historian Saul David wrote that surrounding the Residency was the official district, which covered an area in excess of 60 acres. It contained a variety of detached buildings, including a banqueting hall, treasury, hospital, church, storerooms and houses for Lawrence's subordinates, and was entered through a brick archway known as the Bailey Guard Gate. As soon as word reached Lawrence of the outbreak of the mutiny at Meerut, he began to prepare.
Ditches were dug, walls were loopholed, artillery was put into position. Even a number of local buildings outside of the compound were demolished to maximise fields of fire. Lawrence was determined that his small force would have every advantage possible.
You can still visit the compound today. It's wonderfully preserved.
One thing with the Residency compound here is it's actually really big. You kind of don't get a sense of how big it is till you come. And the Residency grounds where we're exploring now, they're not even the whole thing. It's not even the whole perimeter that was defended in 1857.
When the local Bengal regiments mutinied, Lawrence and the Europeans of the area were here and ready for them. But, showing overconfidence, Lawrence led his small force out of the Residency to bring the mutineers to battle. The fight at Chinhut or Chinhat was a disaster that saw the British and their loyal sepoys well beaten and forced back to their compound.
So the small British garrison here was surrounded by about 8,000 rebel troops. Those rebels, as you can see, had heavy artillery and they were willing to use them. On the 30th of June, the bombardment began. The cannons began to fire. And a VC was won by Corporal William Oxenden out of the 32nd Foot.
His VC citation says, "For distinguished gallantry in saving the life of Mr. Kappa of the Bengal Civil Service by extricating him from the ruins of the veranda which had fallen on him, Corporal Oxenden being for 10 minutes exposed to a heavy fire while doing so." And here, well preserved, is the impressive monument to Oxenham's regiment, the 32nd Foot, who later had fame as the Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry.
It says here, to commemorate the gallant part taken by Her Majesty's 32nd Foot in the heroic defence of the Residency. Also to the memory of the officers, NCOs, men, women and children of the regiment who perished here and at Cawnpore.
Okay guys, I just want to take a quick break there to mention my website, redcoathistory.com. Sign up for my newsletter and receive your free ebook all about the Battle of Isandlwana. There was now about 3,000 people in the Residency compound, just over 1,700 combatants and 1,280 civilians. They were vastly outnumbered, and the odds of their survival looked even worse when disaster struck on the 2nd of July. Lawrence was relaxing on a couch in his quarters when a shell burst beside him and shattered his thigh. He died of his wounds 2 days later. The burial ground where Henry Lawrence lies is close to the Residency. Near the gate is his tomb, a flat slab of white marble on which is inscribed, "Here lie the remains of Henry Lawrence, who tried to do his duty. May the Lord have mercy on his soul." A fitting epitaph for any warrior.
I must say the cemetery here is in fantastic condition. My local friends tell me that a lot of work's gone into cleaning this place up recently, and you can really tell.
Colonel John Inglis of the 32nd now took command as the fighting grew heavier. The sepoys and their allies were numerous and they were brave. They attacked constantly, but
Their biggest problem was that despite their numbers and their weaponry, there was no real overall command and control, and things began to break down, which is why their attacks were repulsed.
against all the odds, the exhausted and overstretched defenders hung on. At the main entrance to the compound is the Bailey Guard Gate. It's named after Colonel Bailey, a former resident of Lucknow. It was here that burly Jock Aitken and his devoted band of sepoys of the 13th Native Infantry dug in and held it throughout the entire siege. The attacking sepoys were determined to take this position, but poor sighting and use of their artillery meant they were never really able to do so.
So just by the gate as you come in is this memorial, this monument erected to the memory of Colonel Robert Hope Moncrief Aitken VC, Bengal Staff Corps, and formerly of the 13th Regiment Bengal Infantry. So this monument, which is starting to fall apart a little bit and is hard to read, is to the memory of the native officers and sepoys of the 13th and 46th Native Infantry, 41st and 71st, the Oud Irregular Force or Avad Irregular Force, native pensioners, new native levies, artillery and Lucknow magazine, who died near this spot. And amazingly, here amongst the bushes is a shoe from one of those sepoys. Okay, it's not really. So it's amazing to think this post here, Mutiny post, was defended by mainly schoolboys. They were under the command of Mr. Schilling, their teacher, and even when they were joined by regular troops of the 32nd, Mr. Schilling remained in command of this post. I think that tells you everything you need to know about him as a man. And the fighting wasn't just happening above ground. Even underground, the sepoys dug down to try and undermine the defences.
At the slightest noise, the defenders would jump to the floor, listening intently. In his book, Sketches and Incidents in Lucknow by Lieutenant Clifford Meacham, he said, "A more serious operation, however, was to lie quietly at the end of the mine, listening to the enemy's miner coming closer and closer, until his pickaxe actually pierced the gallery and exposed the disconcerted workman to the view and to the ready pistol of the gallant solitary sentinel. To perform this exploit was the glory and delight of the much-lamented Fulton. For hours together he would remain at the post, regardless of the intense heat, of the excessive discomfort, and careless of the extreme danger, like a terrier watching at a rat hole." Whew, I don't know about you, but that is not a task I would relish.
Meanwhile, as the defenders battled the rebels as best they could, a relief force was slowly trying to make its way through to them.
Major General Henry Havelock led a small force for the relief of Cawnpore and Lucknow. He reached Cawnpore but was too late to stop the surrender and massacre of the defenders there. See an earlier video of mine for more on that. He then tried to advance to Lucknow, but his force was decimated by illness and too weak to fight its way across the 48 miles of enemy-controlled territory.
With Havelock unable to fight his way through here to Lucknow, he sent a message to Colonel Inglis recommending that he try and break out. But that was unrealistic. With the number of casualties, the number of civilians he had with him, there was no way he could do it.
Major General Sir James Outram now arrived with extra reinforcements and took over from Havelock. His relief force now numbered just over 3,000 men, including 6 British and 1 Sikh infantry battalion. The force was divided into 2 brigades, one under Brigadier James Neal of the Madras Europeans and the other under Colonel Hamilton of the 78th Highlanders. The dangerous march from Cawnpore to Lucknow began on the 18th of September 1857. Days of tough fighting followed. By the 23rd of September, the force had reached the edge of the city.
Brutal street fighting ensued as the Redcoats moved along the narrow alleyways. They were taking heavy fire all the way. Casualties were very heavy. Amongst those killed was General Neal, shot in the head as he advanced by a rebel sepoy.
Neal was and still is a bit of a controversial character, brutal in his dealings with Indians and also insubordinate and highly critical of Havelock. But for all of his faults, he was certainly a brave warrior. On the 25th of September, Havelock and Outram's force finally reached the Residency. The siege had been going on for 87 days, but there was still no end in sight.
So despite managing to fight their way in here, Outram and Havelock realised they were now stuck as well. They'd taken too many casualties to get here, and there was no way they had the force to then break out again.
The extra men, though, meant that the defenders could expand their perimeter and improve their defensive positions substantially. By a sheer stroke of luck, extra food that had been hidden by Lawrence under the Residency was finally discovered. This meant that the men could prepare for more battles to come without the fear of going hungry.
But the battle was far from over. The sepoys were strong, they were stubborn, and they were determined to keep fighting.
That meant that another larger relief force would have to be assembled and battle its way through to the garrison. Let's find out all about it. It was bound to be hard going. The mutineers were well trained by the British themselves, of course. They were tough, they were battle hardened, and they outnumbered the British redcoats. Could this small British army really achieve the impossible? A new British commander-in-chief had now taken over, Sir Colin Campbell. Let's find out a bit more.
By the time he took command in India, Sir Colin Campbell was an experienced officer who had a reputation for good judgment and iron will. He had commanded the Highland Brigade in the Crimean War, with which he had stormed the heights of Alma and won fame in doing so, and immortalised himself and his men during the Battle of Balaclava, when he had faced down the charging Russian cavalry with one battalion of Highlanders and a few supporting units, all without forming a square. He did it in line, a thin red line, as the news report went. Shortly after the outbreak of the mutiny, Lord Palmerston offered him the role of Supreme Commander of the troops in India, and although only holding the rank of Major General, when he accepted this, he was given the local rank of Full General. So he was absolutely seen as the sort of general, the sort of man that the public could get behind and who could be relied upon to rectify the situation and possibly end the war.
That's historian Josh Provan. He's a good friend of the show, very knowledgeable guy. Campbell's relief force consisted mainly of experienced soldiers, many of whom had already fought the mutineers at Delhi. There were the 8th and 23rd Regiments, a wing of the 53rd and 82nd, as well as the 75th and 93rd Regiments. Of course, there were also those hardy Sikh warriors, the 2nd and 4th Punjab Infantry. For cavalry, he had the 9th Lancers and detachments of the 1st, 2nd and 5th Cavalry, as well as Hodson's Horse. There was also 16 guns, some sappers and a naval brigade of around 250 men. In total, the force numbered around 5,000. But what about their enemy? How strong were the mutineers they were about to face?
The rebel forces opposing Campbell were very numerous, but I'm not certain if an exact number is known. Various estimates exist, but the British were certainly under the impression that they numbered somewhere around 40 to 50,000 men.
But there was a very serious problem faced by Campbell and his troops. What was the best route through to the Residency? The previous relief attempts by Outram and Havelock, yes, they had reached the Residency, but they had suffered such heavy casualties they weren't able to break back out, and they were now still stuck there. Campbell didn't want that to happen to him. He needed to get in, he needed to bring everybody out.
A volunteer was needed.
It's the night of the 9th of November 1857. A tall, fair-skinned Irishman prepares for a crazy, dangerous journey through enemy lines. Thomas Henry Kavanagh is a civilian with the Bengal Civil Service. He's dressing up as a badmash, a native swashbuckler, the type of man common in the ranks of the Indian rebels. His face and hands are dyed as he tries to stay relaxed. He wrote at the time, "Considering where I was going to, there was extraordinary hilarity in the whole proceeding, which was most beneficial to my nerves. My turban was readjusted, my clothes subjected to a close inspection, and my waistband adorned by a loaded double-barreled pistol, which was intended for myself, should there be no possibility of escaping death at the hands of the mutineers." His mission, alongside local guide Kunaji Lal, is to sneak through sepoy lines and reach Sir Colin Campbell and his relief force, desperately trying to fight its way through to the besieged British defenders in the Lucknow Residency. But can he make it through? It's an incredibly dangerous journey. Just after leaving, him and Kunaji Lal swam across the river. And then, let's hear it in his words. "We reached the iron bridge over the Gumti, where we were stopped and called over by a native officer who sat in an upper-storied house and seemed to be in command of a cavalry picket. My guide advanced to the light and I stayed a little back in the shade. We said that we had come from Mundaon, our old cantonment then in possession of the enemy, and that we were going into the city to our homes. We continued on along the left bank of the river to the Stone Bridge, about 800 or 900 yards further along, passing unnoticed through a number of sepoys and matchlock men, some of whom were escorting persons of rank in palanquins preceded by torches. There was more light than I cared for, and I would have given much to have had perfect darkness throughout the city. By the way, if you want to read a highly fictionalised but very amusing account of this journey, do read Flashman in the Great Game by George MacDonald Fraser. It's a cracking book based on the real events. Anyway, let's get back to Kavanaugh's own telling of the story. What happened next? Recrossing the Gumpty by the Stone Bridge, we glided by a sentry in the Chowk, or principal street of the city of Lucknow, which, to my great relief, was not illuminated so much as it used to be previous to the siege, nor was it so crowded. I shuffled and jostled against several armed men in the street without being spoken to, and only met one guard of 7 sepoys who were amusing themselves with women of pleasure. Kanaji Lal made several attempts to leave the main street and wander through the dark and narrow turnings, but I resisted his wish to avoid the crowd, feeling that our safety lay in court and inquiry. Seems a risky strategy, doesn't it? What would you have done in that situation? Would you want to stay amongst the crowds and try and blend in, or take the back routes? Anyway, you get the idea. It was a hellish journey through swamps and villages. There was a few scares, and then finally they made it to the advanced British pickets. After some inevitable fun trying to explain exactly who he was finally shown to the tent of Sir Colin Campbell. Here's another excerpt from Kavanaugh's book. As I approached the door, an elderly gentleman with a stern face came out, and going up to him, I asked for Sir Colin Campbell. "I am Sir Colin Campbell," was the sharp reply, "and who are you?" I pulled off my turban and, opening the folds, took out a short note of introduction from Sir James Outram. "This, sir, will explain who I am and from whence I came." It was impetuously read, his piercing eyes being raised to my face almost at every line. "Is it true?" he asked. "I hope so, sir. You do not doubt the authenticity of the note?" "No, I do not, but it's surprising. How did you do it?" I was tired and anxious to be left alone to my thoughts, and I begged of Sir Colin to excuse my telling the story then and to put me to bed. But this brave, crazy Irishman had completed his mission. He was there, and he was now going to be able to help guide the relieving force to the Residency. In Kavanaugh's autobiography, he also wrote, "My good guide Kanaji Lal was employed again in the intelligence department, and the plans in the hands of the chief of the defences of the enemy were prepared on information brought out by him after visiting several places. He had remained with Sir James Outram at the Alambagh, and before the arrival of Sir Colin Campbell repeatedly visited the enemy as a spy. He was most useful, and there can be no harm in repeating that he was badly rewarded." So I don't know exactly what rewards he got, but it sounds like he should have got a lot more, according to Kavanagh. The army set out on the morning of the 12th of November. On November the 14th, they brushed aside the mutineers at the La Martiniere College, which I'm hoping to do an entire film on soon. And then on the 16th, a very heavy day of fighting awaited them.
This garden I'm standing in now is the Sikandar Bagh. It's like a high walled garden, a beautiful garden with these parapets on each corner. It was a strong fortress during the siege of Lucknow.
The building was a Palladian villa and was relatively easy to fortify because it had an exterior wall running around it, which was to some extent already fortified, whether for decoration or for actual defense. I'm not sure.
Campbell's advance guard came under heavy fire, and it seemed unlikely that the assault could succeed. The men were in full view of the enemy. Before a shot had been fired, a staff officer remarked, "If these fellows allow one of us to get out of this cul-de-sac alive, they deserve every one of them to be hanged."
The nature of where the Sikandar Bagh was situated made it difficult to approach in a regular manner. The British had to go through some narrow streets and over some other agricultural obstacles, hauling their heavy cannons with them under tremendous fire. Once these cannons were in place, they blasted a hole in the wall, and that was how the breach was made.
So looking at the photos, I think the breach was more or less about where I'm standing now. It was a small breach, and sadly I can't film it from the outside because it's in the grounds of a government office. But through the Highlanders poured, screaming, "Remember Cawnpore." It was a bitter fight. Meanwhile, while the Highlanders fought for the small breach there, the 4th Punjab Infantry worked their way along the wall and stormed in through the main gateway through here. There was a hell of a fight right here on the end of the bayonet.
And it was here that Subadar Mukarrab Khan jammed his arm in the opening of the gate, which for some reason was being closed, it not being locked to begin with, and managed to keep it open long enough for the gates to be forced. A bitter struggle erupted in the aperture of the doorway, until the other party that had breached the garden wall had gone through the small hole that had been opened by the artillery, managed to get round behind the mutineers that were still trying to hold the passageway in, and put them to flight or killed them there. And that was the entrance. That was the initial entrance. What then happened was, of course, the British began coming in through the gateway. The sappers enlarged the original breach so that more men could get in that way.
Eventually the Sikandar Bagh was completely overrun. It was estimated that there were 2,000 rebels inside. None of them ever left. Fred Roberts, who later became a field marshal, wrote, "They were all shot or bayoneted. There they lay in a heap as high as my head, a heaving, surging mass of dead and dying, inextricably entangled. It was a sickening sight. The wretched wounded men could not get clear of their dead comrades, however great their struggles, and those near the top of this ghastly pile of writhing humanity vented their rage and disappointment on every British officer who approached."
So just on the edge of Sikandar Bagh is this statue, and it's actually to a lady who was killed fighting alongside the rebel soldiers when the Sikandar Bagh was stormed. On the side here there's a slab that says it's to the unknown heroine. And from what I can work out, she was hiding in a tree or fighting from a tree when an officer asked somebody to shoot whoever was in that tree. Someone said, "I see him, sir." He fired and down fell a body. The person he had shot was a woman, whereupon he burst into tears with regret, saying, "I would rather have died 1,000 deaths than have harmed her." It's a really interesting story.
After the fall of the Sikandar Bagh, after that incredibly tough fight, that wasn't the end of the fighting for that day. They moved on to the next defended location.
So just down the road from the Sikandar Bagh is this place, the Shah Najaf Imambara, and it was also seen of some heavy fighting.
It was another brutal battle. One survivor wrote in Blackwood's magazine, "Sir Colin sat on his white horse exposed to the whole storm of shot, looking intently on the Shah Najaf, which was wreathed in volumes of smoke from the burning buildings in its front, but sparkled all over with the bright flash of small arms. It was now apparent that the crisis of the battle had come. Our heavy artillery could not subdue the fire of the Shah Najaf. We could not even hold permanently our present advanced position under it, but retreat to us there was none. By that fatal lane our force could never be withdrawn. Outram and Havelock and Inglis with our women and children were in the front, and England's honour was pledged to bring them out of the fiery furnace. What shot and shell could not do, the bayonets of the infantry must accomplish." Once more it was the 93rd who got thrown into action. They suffered heavy casualties in a musket duel with an enemy who was safely ensconced behind high walls. But what happened next? Here's Josh again.
A sergeant of the 93rd Highlanders named John Patton had been scouting around the perimeter of the mosque while the bombardment had been going on and failing to break through the thick stone walls of the building. He found a small crack or fissure in the perimeter wall, which was just big enough to hold a man. He could just squeeze through it. And having found this out, he went back to Brigadier Adrian Hope and reported this. Hope then took 50 men of the 93rd, and he led them, and the sergeant led them round to where he had found this entry point, and they climbed through there and made for the gatehouse. And the mutineers and the rebels inside this position, finding that the British had penetrated it and were now working to get the gates open, lost heart and evacuated it before an official full assault could land on them. Once they were in possession of the building, the British raised a flag and a signal from the top of the mosque, attracting a lot of gunfire to a signal to the residents that help was indeed still on the way.
And so the toughest defensive bastions in the lead up to the Residency had been captured. Campbell said himself in his dispatch after the day's fighting that the achievements of his soldiers were almost unexampled in the history of warfare. And that is backed up by the sheer number of Victoria Crosses were won. That day, 24 were won, 23 of them in the fighting at Lucknow. I'm not going to stand here and list all of them, but it would be wrong not to mention a few. There was Charles Irwin. He was an Irishman in the 53rd. His citation says, "For conspicuous bravery at the assault of the Sikandar Bagh at Lucknow on the 16th of November 1857. Although severely wounded through the right shoulder, he was one of the first men of the 53rd Regiment who entered the buildings under a very severe fire. He was elected by the private soldiers of the regiment." And that used to happen a lot in those days. If a unit did particularly well in an action, but it was hard for them to single out one man, the privates or the sergeants or the officers would get an opportunity to vote for who they felt most deserved to be awarded the VC. Also, the first ever black recipient of the Victoria Cross earned his award here. William Hall was a black Canadian in the Royal Navy who had also been in the US Navy. His VC was for his heroics serving a Naval Brigade 24-pounder under intense enemy fire outside the Shah Najaf. And there were many, many more brave, incredible men. But the fight was still not over. What happened next?
Campbell relieved the residents the day after the Sikandar Bagh fell, having stormed a further two positions after he had taken the Shah Najaf mosque. Once he had secured the position, he made plans to make his escape with the garrison. And to do this, he had to fool the defenders of the Kaiser Bagh, which was the main rebel position, into thinking that he was going to attack it, so that they wouldn't try and put more pressure on the Residency and try and close it up again as it happened before. So he made very ostentatious preparations as if he was going to storm the Kaiser Bagh, and at the same time secured an exit route, an extraction route, you might call it, all the way from the Residency to the Sikandar Bagh. And during the night, he funneled the civilians from the residence out, and after they were out, he extricated his own troops out to this Sikandar Bagh area, where he then once more had full control of his surroundings. And therefore, this is what sort of makes it like a special ops, black ops operation on a larger scale. It was a specific captive hostage rescue situation almost.
And so Lucknow was finally abandoned. It had been besieged for 148 days. The war, though, despite starting to go the way of the British, was still far from over. The rebels were defeated at the Second Battle of Cawnpore in December, and then in March 1858, Colin Campbell, assisted now by a large force of Nepalese troops, fought his way back to Lucknow and finally captured it on the 21st. Let's now turn our attention to the Central Indian Campaign of 1858. Here, General Sir Hugh Rose was tasked with defeating the rebels across this region. He had cut his teeth in the Middle East and then won accolades for his bravery fighting alongside the French in the Crimea. His most famous adversary here in India was Lakshmi Bai, the Rani of Jhansi. She's a fascinating and charismatic figure that still stirs up debate and controversy. But this is a film about fighting, not politics, so I'm not going to dwell on her story. Rose commanded 2 brigades, including a large proportion of men from the Bombay Presidency Army. This was another force of Indian soldiers that had generally remained loyal. This small force quickly overran a number of small rebel towns and forts before approaching the large and imposing city of Jhansi. Jhansi was regarded as a stronghold of rebel power in India. It had also seen terrible slaughter of Christian women and children at the beginning of the Mutiny. As the siege was progressing, a relief force of around 20,000 men under the command of Tatia Tope approached. Things looked perilous for Rose, and on the 1st of April 1858, battle commenced. As Rose later wrote in his dispatch, "The best way with Indians for making up for numerical inferiority is a determined attack on their weak point. I had therefore intended to commence the attack at daylight, advance in line, pour into the rebels the fire of all my guns, and then double up their left flank. But the enemy, before daybreak, covered by a cloud of skirmishers, advanced against me." This was a brave move by the rebels, but British confidence was high, and a brilliant cavalry charge by the 14th Light Dragoons broke the rebels and forced them to retreat. Rose could now focus on storming the city, and he did that on the early morning of the 3rd of April. The assaulting columns were formed up at daybreak. One of the first men up the ladders was none other than Lieutenant Dartnell, who jumped down among the defenders, receiving several severe sword cuts before Lieutenant Fowler and his comrades could come to his assistance. Now, those of you who watch my videos about the Zulu War probably remember the name Dartnell. He commanded the Natal Mounted Police during the Zulu Wars and went on to become a major general fighting against the Boers. Anyway, back to our story. The two attacking brigades pushed into the city, and the fighting was bloody and hand-to-hand. This quote is from the book The Revolt in Central India, 1857-59, by R.G. Burton. He says, "One of the most remarkable encounters was between detachments of the 86th Regiment and the 3rd Europeans and 30 or 40 of the Sowars, the bodyguard of the Rani, in the palace stables under the fire of the fort. The Sowars, full of bang, that's a drug, defended their stables, firing with matchlocks and pistols from the windows and loopholes and cutting with their swords from behind the doors. When driven in, they retreated behind their houses, still firing or fighting with swords in both hands until they were shot or bayoneted, struggling to strike again even when dying on the ground. A party of them remained in a room off the stables, which was on fire, until they were half burnt. Their clothes in flames, they rushed out, hacking at their assailants and guarding their heads with their shields. All the Sowars were killed. As Rose's men stormed the rest of the city, the Rani escaped with her son and joined up with Tantia Topi." By the way, apologies, his name is spelt differently in various accounts, so I'm probably completely mispronouncing it and even changing the pronunciation as the story goes on. Anyway, back to the story, and there's still a lot more fighting to be done. This is Gwalior, an impressive city with huge walls, and it was now the place where the rebels set up shop. But Hugh Rose and his men soon closed in, and on the 17th of June the Rani of Jhansi was killed by men of the 8th Royal Irish Hussars as she tried to escape. Shortly afterwards the city was attacked. There was heavy fighting, but good old British pluck and the immense bravery of regiments such as the 10th Bombay Native Infantry was enough to win the day and recapture the city. And so, although the war rumbled on into 1859, it was now as good as over. Tantia Topi was captured and hung. Nana Sahib, who had led the rebels at Cawnpore, you may recall, disappeared and was lost to history. British retribution was harsh, but soon calmer heads prevailed and the wounds began to heal. On the 1st of November 1858, authority in India was transferred from the East India Company to the Crown. A promise was made by Queen Victoria to treat all of her subjects equally, whatever their colour or religion, and a pardon was issued to all the rebels except those who had killed women and children. On the 8th of July 1859, peace was officially declared. Please comment, like and share this video and podcast with anyone who loves military history. Next week we will be taking a deep dive into another important subject. You won't want to miss that. Thanks guys, take care.